Good evening, everyone. The seventh edition of the Undergraduate Research Conference has now drawn to a close. Over these 2 days, we have heard students and faculty engage in enriching discourse on various themes such as global mental health, dance as a mode of communication, emergent issues of climate change, women's voices in literature and other medias, and business and evolving context. Each of these themes were elaborated in presentations that amply demonstrated undergraduates engaging in critical thinking and innovative research. We hope that the URC has been a stimulating experience for everyone. May I now request the Vice Dean of JSLH, Professor Jenny Bonerjee, to escort the valedictory keynote speaker, Urvashi Butalia, to the stage.
As we draw to a close, we welcome our valedictory keynote speaker. We are grateful to have with us here today Urvashi Butalia. Urvashi Butalia is a feminist publisher and writer, co-founder of India's first feminist publishing house, Kali for Women. She now runs Zuban, set up after Kali shut down in 2003. She has a long involvement in the women's movement in India and writes and publishes widely on issues related to women and gender. Among her best known publications is the award winning oral history of partition, The Other Side of Silence Voices from the Partition of India. She is currently working on a manuscript on the life of a Hijra, Mona Ahmed. The title of her talk is The Researcher and the Researched Questions of Our Times. We now would like to call Urvashi Butalia to give the valedictory keynote address.
Oh, okay, green, yeah. Um, Let me see. How to get this? Okay, hi everyone. Thank you very much to Jindal and to Priyanka and Gargi for inviting me here. You know, this is only the second time that I have come to this university. The first time was several years ago. And this is the first time I've actually come to do a talk. Some of you may know that I teach at the place that shall not be named, which is across the road from you. But I think, I'm always concerned that in our institutions where we talk about crossing boundaries and crossing borders, between us, between these two excellent institutions which are so close to each other, there is a kind of invisible border that keeps us apart. So thank you for letting me breach it. I was also sort of little taken aback, but also quite pleased to see that picture which you had of me, taken aback at the size of it, because you walk into a room and you see yourself huge on the screen is a bit scary. But, that picture, why I like that particular one, it was taken by an Al Jazeera journalist long ago. And as you may know, Al Jazeera is now being closed down in Tel Aviv. And I think that is something to mourn, because it is one of the few independent news channels, papers, whatever you might call it, in the world, and it is the only one that was giving us the real underground narrative of what is happening in Gaza. So that picture reminded me of that very generous journalist whose name I've forgotten, but who said I could use it wherever. And even though it's quite old, as you can see, I'm much grayer. I don't mind using it because at least I'm gray there. You know, if I had my jet black hair there, then it would look a bit sort of strange to be using that picture. But I also love it because, and if you look at it again, you will see that I'm wearing a watch there, which has two little dials on it, and that's the watch that I stole from my father. And so for me, it's always his memory, and that watch is such an old one that it is now destroyed. It lies in one little packet in my home with all its little needles and everything destroyed here. But there it is. It reminds me of my dad, who passed away many, many years ago. So thank you for putting that up. So you've spent 2 days presenting your work, and ideally, in order to give a reasonable closing talk, I should have attended some of your sessions. But as you know, I have a 24/7 job, and I'm a feminist. That means that, you know, there's no retirement, no time off or anything, so it doesn't allow me to go off for things that I would like to do. But I did, however, read the concept note that was shared with me, and I was delighted to see how inclusive it was, not only in form, but also in content. By form, I mean that it accommodated different kinds of ways of expression, such as the visual, such as the graphic, such as the poster, such as the written, such as the video, and also in terms of content, it was very broad-ranging. And for me, if something can take an interdisciplinary approach, it actually is very, very attractive for me. So I was very pleased to see it, and I hope that what I'm going to say to you today, some of the issues that I will raise will resonate with perhaps some of the questions that I think you must have been tackling in your presentations. In the interest of full disclosure, I should tell you that what I'm going to say today is a somewhat reworked version of a paper that I presented at a conference in Europe last year. And if some of you may, I don't think they recorded it, but if some of you may have seen it or heard it before, but you will recognize the arguments if you know my work at all, because I rehearse these arguments all the time. So, but I just wanted to let you know that please pretend you haven't heard it if you have heard it before. So don't get bored and run off. Okay, so I am going to talk to you as a publisher, as an activist in the women's movement, and a writer, not necessarily in that order. I am not here speaking to you as an academic. That is an identity I vehemently deny and I want no part of, but it kind of creeps into my life every now and again, and I try to twist it in whichever way that I can. So I'm going to do what I love best and what I think I do reasonably okay, which is to tell you a few stories. And the first story I'm going to begin with, the story always begins with yourself, so it's going to be my story. So here it is, and I will read and talk. A little over 25 years ago, I met, while researching a book that I was writing on the partition of India, a hijra called Mona Ahmed, who lived in a graveyard in the heart of Delhi. The bare bones of Mona's story are as follows. She was born a boy, or as we would say in today's language, assigned male at birth. But from a young age, she believed quite strongly that she had been born in the wrong body. And when she was 18, she decided to take the first step to transition to the identity that she knew with a deep conviction in her heart was hers, even if her body told her otherwise. Mona thought, what is the body after all? Just an outwardly shell which can be subjected to the surgeon's scalpel and altered. So she had herself castrated, and she joined the hijras, who form their own closed communities and live, as many of you know, by singing and dancing or offering blessings in return for money. My initial contact with Mona was to interview her for my work on partition, and it was while I was doing that she asked me if I would be interested in writing a book about her. The invitation was a writer's dream, because it's not every day that you get invited to do something like this. I found the project really exciting and daunting, and I agreed to take it on. As I said, by the time I met Mona, I was at the tail end of my research on partition, and I had begun to reflect on the huge mass of material that I had gathered, and I was trying to make some sense of it. You know, the problem of collecting your research and thinking, how am I going to put this in a comprehensible form to be able to communicate? So I was at that stage. That research, conducted over several years, led me to speak often at great length to people, especially women, and over time, many of them became my friends. The more so as the communication, which was initially one way, became more like a conversation and stories began to be shared. So years of involvement in the women's movement in India had taught me a lesson I have carried with me all my life. That is the importance of listening. Indeed, one of the most rewarding experiences of being involved in the women's movement in India was the listening circles that we all formed, where women sat and shared their stories. And it was here that I began to realize that what seemed like everyday anecdotes of discrimination, of violence, of oppression, of heartbreak, were actually stories filled with wisdom and knowledge. It was also that experience that convinced me as a researcher of the value of something researchers have often dismissed as if it is an inferior form of knowledge, the personal story or the anecdote. So I'll come back to talking about this a little bit later, but now I want to say that that experience also taught me the importance of listening to those whose voices are traditionally silenced or not heard, and of learning to listen differently. That is, listening not only to what women said, but also to their silences, to what lay beneath the words and remained unsaid, to what was sometimes unspeakable. Listening to the body language, looking at their hesitations. And it was that experience that opened up for me what was to become a major preoccupation later in life, the question of language and experience. What is experience? How does language describe experience? Is language even equal to experience? If language is created by patriarchy and you're talking of women's experiences, how does one transform into the other, or does it transform at all? These were the questions that I was dealing with. What I also learned while doing those interviews was that once you begin to talk as women, it becomes very difficult to maintain the distance that traditional wisdom tells us has to be there between the researcher and the researched. The women I was talking to became my friends. Our interviews became conversations. At the time, I believed, like many researchers, that while the interview may be an act of power, there is something about it that must somehow remain pure. That relationship cannot be sullied by, say, mundane things like money, as that would corrupt the interaction between the interviewer and the interviewee. But in our conversations, we crossed many boundaries that researchers are not meant to cross. This particular one remained, and I'll come back to this towards the end of my talk. Later, these issues that I had learned in my experience on working on partition resurfaced when I started working on Mona. Our interactions were much more intense. We were two individuals, not a group or a collective, and our conversation spread over 2 decades. So I talked to Mona over 2 decades. And as I said, the decision to write a book on her life was not mine, but hers, but I did agree. She wanted the book, she thought I could do it, and I was not an unwilling partner. Because of this, it somehow felt, and perhaps wrongly, that the hierarchy of the writer and the subject had been subverted. But then there were a whole bunch of things that happened along the way that also complicated this, and I want to talk now about those. So over the years, as Mona and I got to know each other better, our equation as two individuals engaged in the task of writing, one the writer, the other the subject, changed and transformed into a friendship, collapsing the distance that sometimes defines the writer-subject relationship. Instead of researcher and researched, we became just two women talking together. With that, our discussions became very deep, but my dilemmas grew. Like all friends who cast themselves in the role of listeners, as I did, I found myself fascinated and absorbed, but sometimes also disbelieving or skeptical of the things she said, and I wondered how I would write these into my narrative. My rational self told me that a writer's skepticism towards her subject was permissible, part of the writer's freedom of thought, speech, and expression, but my emotional self felt otherwise. I wanted to do right by Mona. I knew she was looking for sympathy, empathy, for understanding, and perhaps also for a kind of justice. So the question was, what or whose in the end would be the truth of my story? Mona was immediately able to sense my doubt and skepticism, and she would challenge me about it. Why was it so difficult to understand, she said, that a human being could be made up of multiple truths, multiple and contradictory desires? These contestations, few and far between, but nonetheless significant, made my task more difficult, but also, I think, more interesting, as did the growing distance between how she saw her life as the subject of this book and how I perceived and then represented what she told me about herself. All of you will be familiar with this dilemma. When the researcher sets up an interaction with their subject, there is also a certain kind of expectation that accompanies that interaction. All too often, the expectation we carry in our heads is what we want and expect. We don't often think of what our subject will or may want, or how the subject may actually subvert the narrative they're giving us from time to time, and we don't often think of how to deal with that. Another question that troubled me when I began working with Mona was this, that effectively I was writing a life, in a way a biography, I suppose. And I was very clear from the start, as was Mona, that the work she wanted me to undertake was her individual story and not the collective story of the Hijra community. So what were the resources that I could draw on? And this is a question that researchers faced. When you try to write something, when you decide on a subject of research, the first question that comes up to you is, what are the resources that I can draw on? And then that's followed by, what are the tools that I can use to access these resources? So when you start to write a life, or more correctly, when you start to write a marginal life, rather than, say, a mainstream life, the materials you can draw on to build the picture you're seeking are often scattered, ephemeral, and thin on the ground. There are, for example, no papers housed in an archive or meticulously catalogued at home, no library sources or newspaper clippings, no letters carefully saved. Most times there isn't even a vast circle of knowledgeable friends and acquaintances whose memories and stories you can draw on. All you have is the person themselves, and if you're lucky, maybe some objects, some clothes, some memories they may have retained, which can offer some clues. But when your subject has wiped out, or more correctly thrown away, as Mona periodically did, all material traces of their past life, when there are no material things, with just a long history of violence and oppression, as often happens with people who come from poorer backgrounds, there is even less to draw on. So it's here that the conversation, the interview, the sense of a person that you imbibe from a certain proximity, these become your sources, but these are often also quite problematic sources. Problematic because, as sources go, life writing relies upon certain given ingredients, I'll put that in quotes, that provide in different proportions the whole that make up a life. The descriptions of moments, of places, of people help to build a sort of linear trajectory, and we believe as we read that we are getting to know the person, to understand them, perhaps even to empathize with them. In Mona's case, the ingredients themselves were elusive. The moment you thought you had grasped something, she would turn it on its head and change the narrative. As a writer, then, I was faced with another dilemma: how to deal with the truth-telling required of writing a life when the archive itself, in this case the person, was unstable, shifting, unpredictable. In the truth-seeking that life writing inevitably involves, or is supposed to be premised on, whose truth should the writer privilege? That of the subject, their own, or that of others? In Mona's case, there was another complicating factor. She was much written about. Every journalist would come to, every foreign journalist particularly, who would come to India and want to write the Hijra story, went to Mona. In fact, at that time, because trans issues were not on the political agenda as much as they are today, the Hijra stories was in many ways the story to be written. So everyone would head off to Mona's place. The well-known photographer Dayanita Singh had worked closely with Mona and had produced a lovely book about her, book of photographs. And as some of you may know, there is a character in Arundhati Roy's second novel, which has a lot of similarities to Mona's life. So the question for me was, what can I write that hasn't already been written? And that question remained. I want to mention a final question that haunted me, and that continues to do so in this writing. As I've said, Mona was a hijra. Born as a male, she knew from an early age she wanted to be a woman. She faced, as many people who want to make the transition of identity from one identity to the other, those who inhabit the spectrum between the two binaries, she faced violence, censure, abuse for behaving like a woman. Finally, she left home and joined the hijras. There, too, she wasn't happy. She wanted to be accepted for who she was in what she called normal society. She used to say to me, "Aap to itne normal ho, I want to be like you." So for her, that was the aspiration. She didn't want to be placed in a silo to the side. So finally, in an attempt to match her body to what her mind already knew, Mona underwent a sort of sex change surgery. I say sort of because SRS was not known or legal at the time. And as I began to write my book on Mona again and again, I asked myself, identity was at the heart of Mona's life and her dilemmas. She was a hijra, a trans woman. Should it not then logically follow that someone from within her community should have been writing about her and not, as I would be known today, a cis woman? Now, I'm sure many of you will be familiar with this question. It comes back to haunt writers all the time. And the question really is, can only like write about like? I have no answer for this question. It still lives in my mind. But every time I ask myself this question about my work on Mona, and I'm troubled by doubt, there is a counter question that comes up, which is that I knew Mona for over 2 decades. During that time, we met every week on Sundays when I was in Delhi. So out of those 20 plus years, perhaps there was a year of Sundays that I missed, if you cumulatively put together all the Sundays in 20 years. And the rest of the time, I met her every Sunday, and we talked for 3 hours, 2 hours, 1 hour. We did things together. We went to places together, and we formed a deep friendship. Now, could friendship, even a kind of intimacy, then trump the legitimacy of identity? And this question I ask myself, and I'm not sure, I don't have an answer to it. As some of you may know, in my professional life, I'm a publisher, and I'm a feminist publisher. One of the choices I made when I set up my publishing house was that we wanted to center stage the voices of women, and that meant that I would not publish men, or I would publish men with a lot of reluctance and after a lot of persuasion, and if there was no other alternative. Now, if I am taking this step in my professional life, but if I'm using a different argument in my writing life and saying, but I can write about Mona because we have a friendship, even though I don't inhabit the same identity, but I will not allow people of the other identity to be published by me as a publisher, then what am I talking about? I don't have an answer. I just want to put this question before you because it is a question that is something that all of us are confronted with. I want to come back to the money question at this point. It's a question that researchers often shy away from, and I think it's time that we started to look at this question. Simply put, it is this: we have for long carried an assumption that if we pay the subjects of our research, the relationship somehow becomes tarnished or impure. I'm not entirely sure where this comes from, but while I was working with Mona, there were any number of occasions on which I was asked to speak about her. Her story was a sexy story, after all. I struggled with this dilemma because every time I spoke, I got paid. What should I have done then? Retain the purity of my relationship but put the money in my pocket? Or paid her part of it and divided it up so that we both were able to, in some ways, within quotes, benefit from what? Does purity work only in one direction? Why do we as researchers shy away from this question? Our time is paid, our travel is paid, our writings benefit us, whether in academic terms or otherwise, but we do not want to pay the subjects we work with. I wanted to ask us why. So I will leave this question with you because I don't have an answer to it, but it's a question that we all struggle with. I'm going to move away from Mona's story now to the remaining two stories in my talk. Are you with me so far? You're not bored to death? You're okay? Okay. Okay. So my second story has to do with a book on queerness in India that was published perhaps a couple of years ago. The author, a well-known Indian academic based outside of India, has strong links with India. For this book, she met and spoke with queer groups in India and spent time with them. In one particular group, she spent time in their office and also accessed their archive and interviewed several people. When the book came out, this particular group was unhappy, and they wrote an open letter to the author, which was shared on a feminist network in India called Feminists India. The letter, while appreciating the book and the author's work generally, raised some ethical and methodological questions about it, in particular about the author's interaction with this particular group. The group pointed to a lack of proper trust building, irregular communication, an extractive attitude to seeking information, and erratic, brief, and informal interactions with members of the group. And they asked, and I quote from them, from the letter, "What does the above involvement show in terms of feminist ethnographic research? From our understanding of feminist research trust and continuous engagement are necessary for ethnographic work and during times and ways that suit both the researcher and the participants." So this whole thing that researchers would do to go into a place to talk to people, but at a time that suited them and never ask if the time suited the researcher, they're raising that question at a time which suits the researcher and the participants. It is only expected, I'm continuing the quote, that we would be consulted and argued with at every step of the research process thereof. They went on to list several things that they felt were not respectful, and that is my word, not theirs. They said that the research proposal had not been shared with them, nor were the transcripts of the interviews, and that they felt as if they had been reduced to data. And they pointed to the need for consent and trust building at every phase of feminist ethnographic research. They also went on to say that the way the academic conducted their research made them feel like they were case study subjects of the third world for the international academic. And they asked, don't we have the space and capacity to think critically about our institutionalization and its complicated histories along with the researcher? And here is the important quote from them. Is the activist space only worthy of being used as experiential evidence of intellectualized arguments and hypotheses? They were no longer willing to be mere case studies. They wanted to be consulted and heard. And then they went on to make an important clarification, and I want to read out that to you. That again is a quote. Our objection to the book does not stem from the belief that we are only comfortable doing research on ourselves and nobody else can research us. So this goes back to the question I was raising 2 minutes back about myself and Mona. But when academic, and especially feminist academic research, is trying to find newer methodologies and research areas where we do not study down, this kind of ethical violence stands out. We are especially disturbed as the author is an international academic of repute. It does make us realize that reputable academics inhabiting the global academic circuit, having minimal stake in the lives and politics of queer and trans persons in India, end up using them as mere data and case studies in their research projects. And more than this, it makes us more mindful about how to navigate and interact with global academics in future. At all times, and that quote is ended now, at all times in their critique of the work, the group did not devalue the work of the author and indeed spoke with tremendous appreciation and respect. They were very clear that their objections pertained only to themselves, and they pointed to the ambivalences around these issues as subjects meriting feminist discussion, locating the ways in which feminist research had opened up hitherto closed areas for research. Now, I'll come back to this in a moment. I want to just bring your attention back to the questions that I raised in my discussion on Mona, which I think are very pertinent here in different ways. So one of my concerns was whether without the standard tools of research, that is a stable archive, some within quote solid material, my work on Mona would stand up to scrutiny. So what sort of writing can you build if your subject is evasive and unreliable, shifting, changeable, and there are no reliable sources for you to draw on? Moreover, my question was about what legitimacy I had as a cis woman to be working on Mona. And the third thing was that the distance that should have traditionally been there between the researcher and the research had been collapsed in this case, and we had actually become friends. The members of this queer group raised different but related questions. They asked if they were not owed respect, they wanted to be seen as partners in the research and not merely its subjects. After all, they said they were thinking beings with agency, and they deserved to be taken seriously. And did the writer not have an obligation to keep them in the loop at all times? They talked about being reduced to data. They felt this was an insult. Now, until feminist research methodologies began to question existing methods of research and the tools that those existing methods of research relied on, data was considered sacrosanct, something that gave your research meaning and weight. But imagine this data gathered in the days that feminist research had not opened up and made the domestic sphere, the private sphere, a legitimate area of research. So what would the data be if an ethnographer went to an Indian village and did an ethnographic study of something in the village and spoke only to the men in the village and produced a study that became a standard study that was based on data? Those data would be false, they would be partial, and they would leave things out. But when feminism, nearly half a century ago, when women's studies made its appearance on the world stage, led by India and Indian feminists, it was then that the argument for making the personal, private, domestic sphere a legitimate area of research became part of academia. And when the researcher crossed the threshold, the researcher did not see statistics and numbers, but saw instead stories, relationships, feelings, emotions, songs, other thoughts, and therefore the researcher had to develop different tools to look at this research. And when this group is pointing to the ways in which research has opened up and the top-down approach has changed because of feminist interventions, the questions that they are asking are, can they, as subjects of that research, be merely speechless, agency-less researchers who become the material on which research is kind of based? So those were the questions. They expected the writer to engage with them continuously and to be open and transparent. But the question is, can this actually be done? Is it even realistic to think of it? In this case, for example, the academic was placed at some considerable distance geographically from the group, and she was bound by the rules of her university. Since you're all in different universities, I'm sure you have particular sets of protocols that have to do with research. And she was bound by those rules, particularly to do with confidentiality. So for example, if she had interviewed a woman sitting in the office of that NGO, and that woman did not speak English, but spoke in an Indian language in which she interviewed her, could the transcript of that interview have been shared with the group who wanted to see it because the woman was a member of the group? But the academic could not because the rules of her university bound her not to share it with anybody other than the person. But if the person doesn't have the language, how do they access the thing? So it is not an easy thing to do, but it's a problem for us. Okay, I'm going to take you now to my final story, and I promise to end with a small joke, which I hope will make you laugh, because these are all serious issues. So my final story has to do with a book co-authored by 9 women across 2 continents that offers some possible answers to these questions. The book is called Playing with Fire in English. It was first in Hindi and then it was translated in English. It came about through a collective process of sharing intimate personal stories within a supportive group, of giving voice to some of these for the first time. It was in collective discussions between the researchers and the researched that a method was identified which would keep the stories of the women in their own voices. They chose to write, read together, and share their individual stories in the form of diaries, which each woman wrote. The two, within quotes, academic writers then undertook to write the stories into a compiled and collective narrative. These were then read back to the original writers, and it was only when the group as a whole was happy with the text that it was finalized. The book, when published, was credited to the whole group, all 9 names, and to the collective that they had formed. The women spoke of the process thus, and I quote them: "When we were preparing ourselves to write this book, we felt a sense of adventure creeping into our bones. Would this world be able to see us, formerly uneducated women, as writers? Would it give us the same respect and wisdom that it accords to all its upper caste and elite scholars and thinkers? Would our readers be able to value the courage and trust with which we have pointed out our most cherished and intimate moments, our deepest sorrows and wounds of humiliations, and everything sweet and bitter that we have encountered in our lives?" And I think this is such an important quote because actually the women, when they talk about their interactions in the book, the group was not a homogeneous caste group. It was made up of upper caste women, of Dalit women, and writing the personal diary was not easy because writing it with honesty, you had to write about all these things that made for tension and difference in your relationships, particularly in terms of caste. And you had to be open to be able to receive those things and to talk about them. And how do you rebuild relationships after that kind of openness? So these were questions that troubled the women, and they found it really, really difficult to write these personal diaries. But they did it because they all believed in it. In the book that they wrote, the women asked certain key questions which resonate strongly with the questions raised by the group that I have mentioned above. They asked, what is the difference between social empowerment and intellectual empowerment? Are they not two sides of the same coin? The women's work was grassroots organizing. The work of the 2 urban women was to put together the books that came out of their experiences. So they asked, how do we then frame intellectual labor and activist grassroots organizing? Why should one be on a higher plane? Who becomes the subject of knowledge and who its purveyor? Does knowledge and expertise exist only in the academy, in places of power, or does it also exist in the minds and hearts and daily lives of the powerless? The women involved in this collaborative research project worked together over 2 years, sharing their stories, confronting their fears and prejudices, facing their families, working together to write their book. And it wasn't easy for them in their families because when they wrote their diaries, they also wrote about intimate violence in the family and about their husbands and their children. And then that book became public and everybody read it, and it wasn't easy for them. In the process of sharing, they understood themselves better. They understood, for example, that while poverty may be an overarching phenomenon, the ways in which it played out in the life of a Dalit woman was very different from the way in which it played out in other lives. The ways in which a multi-caste group interacted with each other had to be informed by this. The knowledge that they created was radically different, hugely subversive. It was based not on an extensive reading of multiple sources, nor on a gathering and analyzing of data, but on the lived experiences of women. For these women, writing the diaries on which their book was eventually based led them to compare each other's experiences, and that led, to give you just one example, I've said this already, to a nuanced understanding of caste. Equally, the women became aware through the process of working with each other and supporting and trusting each other of the value of understanding the wisdom that lay in their lived experiences. And this valuing of your own experience allowed them to put in perspective the experience of the 2 women who actually became the book writers. The 7 who wrote their diaries did not see themselves as book writers, but sharing everything, etc., they equalized the work. So I'd like now to bring together the threads of what I'm saying and ask ourselves, you and me, some questions. So what is, first of all, the transformative potential of these new methods of research? The academy in which we work is changing. No longer is objectivity the holy grail. No longer is the questionnaire adequate. No longer are the subjects of our research passive. But it's not only research and its scope that is changing, but the empirical base on which much research is based is also changing. For example, communities that were hitherto silenced are strongly articulating their sense of themselves, their sense of agency, and research has to take that into account. Given this, how must we think of our research differently? What are our responsibilities as researchers, not only to ourselves, but to the subject, the territory, the people that we are talking about? Let me give you a couple of examples here. All of us know that given the ways in which our countries are going, the constraints on what we can and cannot do as researchers, whether we are based in the country or outside of it, are only increasing. The dangers, for example, are to yourself. You may no longer get a visa to go home. If you have family there, this is a tragedy. But the danger is also to your subjects, for they can be targeted for participating in your research. This is not the only issue we have to deal with. There are others. As a feminist researcher based in India, not a month goes by when I don't receive a letter from an academic abroad saying they're coming to India between such and such a date, and they have this research project to do, and can I be available to them to interview for such and such a thing? There is no question that my time might be equally valuable, or I may not be able to meet them, but just because they are coming from abroad, they bring that power with them. Before I let this go, I want to touch briefly on the question of ethics. What does the researcher bring to her subjects or to the subject she is working on? And again, let me give you the example here from my work on partition and sexual violence. We all know that when the history of partition started to be opened up, the question of sexual violence against women, the mass rapes and abductions that took place, all of that opened up for the first time and came into the public domain. In the course of researching this subject, I was hunting for materials to look at which might throw some light on what had actually happened. And I came across a book which was a limited publication, like a government publication, so not a book that went out into the public market. And I found it in a secondhand bookshop, and I purchased it. And that book was like, I think there are only perhaps 2 or 3 copies of it around, and I think I have one of those 2 or 3 copies. It is a district by district listing from Pakistan of women who were abducted and children who were abducted and taken away. And it has 22,000 names in it, and it is a fair assumption that at least 80 to 90% of those women would have been sexually assaulted as well. Now, this book lists the woman's name, her age, her location, where she was found, which family she belonged to, more or less which class and caste she belonged to, and in whose company she was last seen. So it is what one would call a researcher's gold mine. And when I came across this book, I was very, very excited. And I used some of the information from it in my book on partition. But since then, this book has been with me and locked away in a cupboard, because part of me, the researcher, is excited at the potential of putting this information out on the net and seeing what kinds of stories can be garnered. But the other part of me, the activist who belongs to the women's movement, feels I cannot do this. I cannot make those women who may very likely all be gone by now, but their families would still be around, and the chances are most families will not know the histories of their mothers who had lived through sexual violence. So how can I, as a researcher, in the interest of some notion of truth, make this information publicly available? So what happens is that I sit on it, it's locked in my cupboard, I don't know what to do with it. Periodically, somebody hears of it, or I speak about it, and I get a letter from a researcher saying, "Ma'am, can you lend this book to me for 5 days?" And I duck under the table and don't answer, because I don't have an answer. But what is my responsibility as a feminist researcher here? To share this information or to guard it and hide it? I don't know. So those are the kinds of questions. So I'm going to end now by quoting to you a lady that we all know called Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak. When Spivak asked her question, can the subaltern speak? I think the real issue was not that the subaltern wasn't speaking or was unable to. Rather, it was that her speech was not comprehensible or hearable to the researcher, and the researcher was unwilling to listen. It's never that women can't speak. We do, we can, we want to, we do. But nobody damn well listens to us. And that's the problem. This is where we have to locate the problem. Speech doesn't happen in itself. It becomes meaningful only if there is someone to listen. And the new research methodologies are challenging in the ways in which we look. We took data and the larger picture, the workable sample, the snowball method, and all of that, to be the only truths. But it is not. There are other truths that are very important, and I think they lie in the stories that we tell, and it is important that we start listening to them. So the subjects of research today are saying, no, we will not play the role you expect us to play and legitimize and further your career. We'll speak for ourselves. And that's what is so exciting. So I am here not offering you any answers to the questions that I have raised in this talk, but I'm asking that we, all of us as researchers and writers, try to think of research differently, not as something we do to others, but as something we do with others. And without these others, our research would be meaningless. And finally, in closing, I want to tell you a little story which sums up most of what I've been talking about. And if I'd said it at the beginning, you wouldn't have had to listen to this long talk. But it comes from one of the diaries of the women I talked about, the 7 women who wrote diaries, the Sangtin writers. And is often told by members of that group, which is called the Sangtin Kisan Mazdoor Sangathan, to which the women belong. And the story is a story of a researcher who arrives from the first world to the third world and is going to a village to do research. In order to get to the village, he has to cross a river. In order to cross the river, he has to hire a boat. So the boatman sees him coming. He's used to people coming, and he takes them across. So he pitches up at the shore. The researcher gets in, and then the boat is being rowed to the other side. So the researcher thinks that I may as well start my research now. Here I've got a subject in the boat. So he says to the boatman, do you know anything about capitalism? And the boatman says, no, what is that? I've not heard of it. So he said, oh my God, you don't know anything about capitalism? That means 25% of your life is gone because you don't know this important development. So the boatman looks very resigned. Then a bit later he says to him, do you know anything about Marxism? And the boatman says, no, I don't. And he says, oh my God, half your life is gone. You don't know about Marxism. And then there's a bit of a silence. Then comes the third question. Do you know anything about feminism? And the boatman says, what is that? I don't know. And he says, oh my God, 3/4 of your life is gone. At which point, there is some agitation, and the boat overturns, and both people fall into the water. And then the boatman says to the researcher, do you know how to swim? And the researcher says, no. So he says, then 100% of your life is gone. Thank you very much for listening. Do you want me to stay here or go there? Go there?
Discussion. Thank you so much, ma'am. We will now open the floor for a discussion round.
the sake of research, for our knowledge and for the sake of the class's knowledge as well. And I feel like in a lot of ways, a lot of us have felt the disparity between the researcher and the researched. And it just kind of leaves me wondering, is there a way to get around the moral dilemma of attaining knowledge at the cost of ethics?
So I think you're asking two things there from what I can see. One is the question of ethics, to which I think there is no easy answer. The other is the distance between the researcher and the researched. There, I think that we can actually start asking ourselves, why is this distance necessary? Does it have to be there? And where did this come from? Who decided that there had to be distance? Because the distance is also premised on not getting personally involved, okay? Somewhere it holds up this thing of objectivity. But I think that there is no such thing as objective research. When research was based on data only, then we were able to hold up the myth of objectivity much more. And I'm not saying that we should dismiss data. You know, data gives us vital information. We can't knock it and throw it out of the window. But I think in a sense, there is always a human being at the end of the data. And is there a way that we can look at our research methodologies that allow us to encompass both of those things? To get say maybe you have the larger picture with data and to complicate it with the personal story that comes, which might add a dimension to it, nuance it in some ways. So I think that we are at this moment, because of new developments in research, we're at a moment where we can start raising these kind of questions and having a debate about them. So I'm not saying I have answers. These are questions also that worry me, but I think it's time to start thinking about these and talking about them. The question of ethics is equally troubling, and I think there it's very difficult to know what to do. So for me, the thing is, if you're aware that there is an ethical dilemma at the heart of research, that is a first step to dealing with that. And let me give you an example from my own work. So when I was working on partition, one of the things as a feminist, when I went into that work, I should have known, but I did not know. I should have known that there would be sexual violence. It was in the mid-'80s, right? And we were not oblivious to the question of sexual violence. We had seen it around the world. Why didn't I think of it in our own history? So when I went into it and started discovering it, I was actually quite shocked by it. And then as the exploration got deeper, in the initial days, I was not able to find anyone to speak to who had lived through that experience. Now, when I did find women who were willing to talk, after they had spoken, a couple of them, I didn't find that many, but after that, they said to me, please don't tell our story. And I thought, what? How can I not tell the story? Because, you know, there is the excitement of finding what you're looking for as a researcher, finally, after a lot of difficulty. And then you have somebody saying to you, don't tell the story. And one of the women said to me, don't tell my story because my children don't know this, that their mother has this in the past. So I had to ask myself this question, to what do I owe, what is my sense of responsibility? Do I owe allegiance to some abstract notion of truth? Or do I owe allegiance to this living, breathing person whose life my truth will impact while it might advance my career? And then I had to think, okay, how can I talk about this without talking about it? And it's not only a question of hiding somebody's identity, because that's never adequate. You know, even if you hide it, the person knows it's them. So I had to find a way of talking about it, and it made me think about the question of women's silences and why women maintain certain silences and why I, as a feminist going into that, have to now put aside my feminist assumption that we must break women's silences, and the breaking of that silence will in some way free up the story. There's no such thing. So in the end, I ended up saying to myself that, okay, I have to respect that silence, but I have to understand what it means, and I have to find a way of talking about it that does not place that woman at the center. So it was a very deep ethical dilemma, and you might think that I have compromised, but in my head and in my heart and in my soul, I feel I've done the right thing. So I think you can't generalize, but with everything, I think you have to weigh up the things and see what works best for you.
Hello, good evening. It was lovely hearing you, ma'am. And I am just curious as to what your reasons are for distancing yourself from the label of an academic and your critiques of academia in general.
Okay. All good reasons. So I said 2 or 3 times I'm a publisher. That basically, I'm a publisher and a writer, not necessarily in that order. I left academics behind long ago. It's not that I was on that path. I was going to be doing a PhD. I was going to Hawaii to do a PhD. Then some friends of mine said to me, can you surf or swim? And I couldn't do either. They said, don't go. There's nothing other than surfing and swimming. So I gave that up and I started working in publishing because I really wanted to set up my own publishing house. But the thing is that the field of academics, I find it very constraining because you have to work within the disciplinary boundaries of the particular discipline that you might choose. That was the case in my time when I was growing up, when I was your age. For you, it is actually the cross-disciplinarity is much easier for you now than it was for us. I mean, I could not even change. I wanted to change from doing literature to doing sociology in BA to MA. Impossible. You couldn't make that transition. So I didn't want to be in a field that constricted me so much. And as somebody who stood outside that discipline, or the many disciplines, I felt much more freedom to write. So when I started writing my partition book, I tried to write it as an academic book. It drove me completely mad. You know, then after a while, I just thought, I'm going to throw this away. I'm going to write it from how I feel it. And I'm not ashamed of how I feel about it. I'm not impartial about this subject. It makes me cry every time. It's deeply emotional. I am a child of partition refugees. So how can I get any objectivity? So let's not pretend there is. So there were so many things about academia that didn't appeal to me. And being outside of it and being a publisher means that you get to access thinking across disciplines and in many different ways, which just shows you the excitement and gives you, I mean, I can read the things that academics write. I don't have to be one of them. Do you see what I mean? So that's why I kind of place myself outside of it.
Hello. So we have time for one last question only. So. Sure.
Should I? Okay.
Maybe I can respond to them together. So if you both ask your question, and then I'll.
Hi, ma'am. Firstly, I'm a big fan of your work. So yeah, my question to you is: at one point of your research process, and there comes the potential biases and the stuffs where you have to navigate through them. What is your major advice that you can give to us as young researchers who are entering the field?
To look at biases, your own. Okay.
Hello, ma'am. I wanted to ask that was there any particular methodology that you had used to ensure a diverse range of voices that were necessary for your book? Like, was there any particular method?
I didn't hear the last part. Was there a particular methodology that I had used to ensure?
A diverse range of voices for your book, The Other Side of Silence.
Okay, okay. Yeah, that's a, yeah. I am glad you asked that question, actually. Okay, I'll come back to it because, and let me just try to respond to this. So, I don't know if I can actually give you any advice on that. I would say that the first step really is to be aware that you have biases, and most of us are unaware of our biases because we don't think we are biased, we think everybody else is, yeah? So I think that if you are aware of your biases, then that's a step, and then you have to decide how to deal with them. So I know, for example, that I have a bias against academia. You know that, no? So just said it. I think it's okay. I don't have to do anything about it. Some biases are okay. You know, feminists have a lot of biases against guys. Sometimes they're okay, sometimes they're not. But I think that you have to just constantly be looking at yourself. Research is often, when we step into research, we go out thinking, okay, let me say this another way. Often my students at the university across the road will say to me, they'll kill me if they hear this, you know, but they say to me, ma'am, you know, we go to villages to talk, and we talk to people about feminism, but they don't want to listen to us, and they won't change. Now, how can you even begin with the assumption that you, with your knowledge, will go somewhere and tell someone something, and by your mere act of telling, that person will recognize the rightness of what you're saying and will immediately change? It's an impossibility, you know? So, and that's where the bias comes in, because you think the bias is the urban-rural bias. Because I'm urban, because I'm educated, because I'm in a university, because I'm listening to this professor talking about feminism all the time, I think I know about feminism. And you may well do, but in order to have a conversation with the person that you're maybe going to do research on, you need to listen to them, you know, and the way they see you, you need to examine yourself and see if that is how you see yourself also. So I think, in a sense, that awareness comes with the more you interact with people, the more you listen to them, that awareness comes, because then when you listen to people with respect, which is the most important thing, so even if it's somebody whose views you don't like, but you need to listen to them to understand how to respond to them. And I think that may help you to deal with biases. It's a good question, but I don't really have a fantastic answer for you, but maybe you should just start thinking more about biases and listening to people, okay? That question of yours about people's voices, so in the book on partition, it was not such a problem for me. Most of the people I spoke with were Punjabi speaking or Hindi speaking. And because I'm a Punjabi, I understood what they were saying. And I chose to transcribe all the interviews myself. And I would translate and transcribe at the same time. Now, often what happens is that if you work through an interlocutor, like a researcher or somebody, if you don't know the language, and they will transcribe, and then you will have, you're at several points removed, so you don't know how far you're capturing the authenticity of the voice. I felt that in that book, I was able to capture the voices to some extent, because even now when I read those interviews, I see the difference in them. I hear different voices in them. But I have not been able to do it that successfully in the work that I'm doing on Mona. So in Mona, the book on Mona, which is, the manuscript is complete, but I'm still reading through it and trying to figure out what to do with it. I was how to use Mona's voice, you know. I'm the one who's telling the story, but the story is based on initially some interviews, then many conversations, and then on some pages from a diary that Mona wrote, but only like about 30, 40 pages which she gave me. The rest of the diary she kind of destroyed. Those pages are in Urdu. I've had them translated by a friend. When I render her voice in English, it sounds to me like my voice. And I can't see the difference between her voice and my voice. Somewhere I'm going wrong. And I have shown it to a couple of readers, both of whom have come back and said the same thing, that it sounds like you, it doesn't sound like her. So I have to go back now to it. I think what I'm going to do is to go back and have the Urdu read out to me by somebody so that I can hear it. And maybe that will help me to approximate her voice. And if I can't, I will not use it, because I can't turn her into my voice. That would be an injustice. So it's a tough choice, but I'll just have to see. But it is a struggle. That is a struggle, and there's no formula, but it's just something that you have to work with. Okay, do we have any other questions?
Thank you so much, ma'am. We would now like to call the Vice Dean of JSLH, Professor Joyni Banerjee, for the vote of thanks.
Well, first of all, I think many thanks are due to many people at this point. But first of all, thank you so much to Urvashi Butalia to come and to make us think through the research process. You know, as I mentioned, we use your work in some of our courses, and I think the beauty of it is also in the simple way you tell the stories. But I think those of us who engage in feminist research also know how difficult it is to put it across that simply. And actually, I think your talk really made us think that what appears so simple has so many layers and so many nuances, you know, from the process of doing research to the tremendous burden of responsibility while writing it, and of course as readers when we interpret it in our own ways. So thank you again for bringing those stories that we have read to life as well. I would now like to call upon stage our Dean, Professor Kathleen Wodrowski, to felicitate Urvashi Butalia.
No, I didn't want you to come too far.
I can do it.
Okay.
Oh, okay. So can everyone hear me? Okay, good. Thank you so much. This was just wonderful. And I don't know if you have one of these already.
No, I don't.
Well, this is,
Oh my God, it's got my name on it.
yes. You don't want it known, but don't let the people across the road see it.
You remember the pinstripe suit? Okay.
And
Thank
here
you so
is-
much.
You're welcome. And we'll put it in this. Oh, come on.
Take a break.
Here, Johnny, come on with us.
Thank you.